Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Legal Cheek's very first event of 2021, all about law firms in the era of sustainable capitalism with Travers Smith. My name is Sophie Yantian. I'm an events coordinator here at Legal Cheek, and today I'm joined by a panel of speakers from Travers Smith. We have Rafaela, an associate in the private equity and financial sponsors group at the firm. We have George, a partner in the private equity and financial sponsors group, Paul Mullis, the Sustainability and Health and Safety Officer, and Sam, the Director of Pro Bono and Senior Counsel at the firm. Now, I'll hand over to the speakers to introduce themselves in just a second, but firstly, a very big welcome to everybody who's joined. We've got over 400 people in the audience, so it's great to see so many of you here. Now, the panel discussion will take place here on stage from 4 till 5 before we move over at around 5 o'clock to the expo or some virtual networking, but I'll explain how all of that works a little bit later on. Now, over to your right, under stage on the right-hand side, you have the chat bar, and this is where you can pop in all of the comments for the speakers as they're discussing your questions over the course of the next hour. We're also running a poll today, so you can find that over under the events tab on the right-hand side, and you'll see there's a subheading that says polls. You'll see there we've got the questions that we've got in today with a few options for you to vote on. So do make sure you cast your vote, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on, see how you voted and get the speakers' takes on that. But for now, I'd like to welcome our speakers. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So each of the speakers is going to be giving a short talk, and then we'll come back together for a panel discussion. So I'm going to hand over to George, who's going to be delivering the first of our short talks. So Rafaela, Sam, Paul and I, we're going to hop off the video. And George, it's over to you.
Brilliant. So thank you, Sophie, and thanks very much to all of you for joining us. I can see from the number in the top of my screen that there are over 400 of you here, which is slightly daunting, but I can't see any of your faces, so maybe I can just pretend to myself it's slightly less. One of the few advantages to video calls. So I'll start with a quick introduction. As Sophie said, my name is George. I'm a partner in the private equity and financial sponsors team at Travers Smith. And as a team, we focus on transactional work, so mostly mergers and acquisitions for private equity funds and other financial sponsors, like infrastructure funds and real estate funds. So that's my day job, and I'm very happy to talk about that later if that's of interest to anyone. But perhaps the main reason that I'm here today and not one of the other partners is because of my role in relation to the legal aspects of sustainable business, or you obviously often hear it referred to as ESG. Now, I encounter this partly through my work as a private equity lawyer, actually. It is part of my day job, but it's also as a member of the steering group for what we call our sustainability initiative, that this forms a big part of my role at the firm. And that initiative seeks to coordinate and maintain expertise across the firm in advising on related issues. So what I'll do now is I'll talk very briefly about what we mean at Travers Smith when we talk about sustainable business or sustainability, why I think that's really important to the business community generally, to businesses globally, in fact, and why it's important to us, Travers Smith, as a firm, and then finally a little bit about what we are doing about it. So first point then, what do we mean by sustainable business? I mean, it's a very broad term and it's used in lots of different ways, to be honest, but to me, a sustainable business is a business or an enterprise which certainly has no negative impact. I think actually it needs to be a business which has a positive impact on both the environment and society, whilst obviously also being economically sustainable in its own right. So that's a really broad definition, and it's not just about being environmentally responsible. I think when people hear the words sustainability, sustainable finance, sustainable capitalism, they tend to think immediately about the environment, and that is a huge part of it. But the way we use the term, it encompasses a really broad range of ethical concerns, everything from ethical taxation to fair treatment of workers, modern slavery, even competition lawyers have a part to play in sustainable business. So it touches almost all parts of our firm, actually. And so why is it important to business generally? Why is sustainable business practices important to business? Well, I'm going to take it as read that it's a good, a moral thing to do, and I'm going to focus instead now on why business leaders need to think very seriously about sustainable business issues. First and foremost, it's very much in the public eye. There's an ever increasing demand for businesses to behave responsibly towards society and the environment, and I'm sure you've heard there's increasingly more and more talk about concepts like stakeholder capitalism. You might have heard of corporate purpose. This is the idea that businesses should have some purpose which benefits society or the environment, and which is broader than just seeking profit. Stewardship, the idea that businesses should be run and capital should be allocated with a view to creating sustainable benefits for society and the environment, and not just making money for shareholders. And it's very high up the legislative agenda. It's not just in the public eye, but particularly in relation to climate, the fight against climate change, where new law and regulation are rapidly proliferating. There's a huge sort of influx of new law in that area, but it's not just climate. Again, the much broader range of topics that I mentioned earlier are also being picked up in new legislation. And typically, this new law and regulation is designed to force greater transparency by businesses about what they're doing to tackle these issues. But I think increasingly we're going to see more and more things being prohibited, actually harmful activities being prohibited. And one example of that is perhaps the newly accelerated ban on the sale of petrol and diesel cars in the UK, which will now be from 2030. So I think you'll see more and more of that. So businesses can't ignore it, both from a reputational perspective, but also from an operational one. It will directly change what they can and can't do. But even absent legislation, for a long time, I think it's been the case that it's actually very hard to see how responsible investors, being a private equity lawyer, I tend to come at this from the perspective of investors rather than operational businesses, but it affects regular business leaders too. But it's very hard to see how responsible investors can avoid taking sustainable business issues into account when making investment decisions, because it's very clear that they can result in very real damage, often fines, if not reputational damage to the underlying business. And actually, on occasion, they can represent very significant opportunities as well. And I think, it's almost impossible, I would have thought, to get through tonight without talking about COVID. COVID, I think, has actually strengthened resolve by making that fact even more obvious to people. I think it's improved people's awareness of the interdependence of human activity and the environment, and it's taught us that we need to be much better prepared. We need to understand that better, and we need to be better prepared to deal with global shocks. So I think it has encouraged people to focus on ESG, and I think it's also encouraged people to focus on it for more altruistic reasons. You've only got to look at the UN's Build Back Better campaign, which aims to ensure that we come out of this pandemic in a much better, more sustainable place. And I think there is genuinely a growing sense that the way that we respond to this pandemic needs to involve addressing some of the inequalities in society, which have meant that actually the people worst affected by the pandemic have often been the most vulnerable. So I think it's only going to grow in as an area of focus. So then why is it something that we, Travers Smith, want to focus on? Well, it may seem fairly obvious, having given everything I've just said, but if you think about who our clients are as a firm, we as a firm, we focus on advising very large businesses, often international businesses, in both companies and asset managers, asset managers being my particular focus. And we advise them on very complex transactions, disputes, and regulatory issues. So for all the reasons I've just mentioned, sustainable business is right at the top of the agenda for the most senior individuals within our client organizations, both current and targeted. It being major organizations, large organizations, they're often squarely in the public eye. And actually, particularly in the case of asset managers and larger listed companies, they are, I think it's fair to say, the primary targets for the new legislation which is currently being introduced. So because of this high degree of focus on the area and the breadth of the issues involved, our clients and our prospective clients are continually faced with an ever increasingly complex legal framework that they need to navigate. And that complexity, that legal complexity, is an opportunity for us. That's where we thrive, because not only is it right that we focus on this stuff, our clients really need us to. They need us to help them navigate the legislation that's already there and to anticipate the legislation that's coming down the tracks. And because it's so interdisciplinary, as a truly full service firm, which we are at Travers Smith, and I think personally one which is particularly good at working together actually between departments in a very collaborative way, I think we're really uniquely placed to be market leaders in advising on these issues. So what are we doing about it? Well, we have this new, it's not new, sorry, it's been around for some time, the Sustainable Business Initiative, and I can tell you a bit more about that later perhaps, but that is a series of groups of individuals within the firm, various levels of seniority, all of whom have an interest in sustainable business issues, and who work together to ensure that we are continuing to innovate, even designing new financial products that promote better ESG behaviour, and remaining market leaders and advising our clients on these issues. And we work very hard as well to make sure that we are operating our own business in a sustainable way. And others will tell you a bit more about that later, particularly Paul. And we also work hard to assist organisations who we think have a positive impact on both society and the environment through our pro bono programme, which Sam and Rafaela will talk to you a bit about, among other things. So I think that's probably enough from me for now. Thanks again for joining us. I really hope you enjoy the rest of the session, and I look forward to answering some of your questions and discussing these topics a bit more later on. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, George. So up next, giving his short talk is Sam. So Sam, if you want to join us on stage. And Sam is the Director of Pro Bono and Senior Counsel at Travers Smith. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, George, for your talk. As Sophie says, I'm the Director of Pro Bono at Travers Smith, and prior to that, I was in our disputes team for about 12 years, and I'm a Senior Counsel at the firm. I came into the Director role in March last year, and my first task, if you like, was to create a programme that we could expand upon and grow. And so I created a programme that had 4 pillars, and the first pillar is climate, environment and sustainability. So I'm going to talk mainly to that, but just for context, the second is diversity, inclusion and social mobility. The third is vulnerable groups, and that's the work we do with refugees and victims of domestic abuse and human trafficking. And the fourth is rule of law. But for the purposes of today, and in the 5 or so minutes that I've got, I'm just going to give 1 or 2 examples responsive to each of the climate, environment and sustainability elements. So if I start with climate, the 2 clients that I want to talk about are the Chancery Lane Project and Green Finance Institute. Now, the Chancery Lane Project is a collaborative of lawyers in the UK who are working to develop new contracts and model laws to tackle climate change. I'm not going to talk too much about the substance of what we do with them because Rafaela is going to touch on that a little later. But it's fair to say that we are working across a number of departments on environmentally focused drafting initiatives as part of our work with the Chancery Lane Project. They have a saying there, which is if you can change the precedent, you can change the world. Now, I think only a lawyer would come up with a saying like that, but that is effectively what we are up to. We are trying to change the precedent, the contracts that form the framework of how businesses interact, and if you like, adjust their focus so that they are looking more at the environmental as to purely the economic. And that's very much the thrust of what we're doing with them. With the Green Finance Institute, or GFI, they were established in 2019. They're effectively the interface between public and private sectors as we sort of work collectively, I suppose, to green the economy. One of the main ways they do that is by forming expert coalitions within a particular sector to look to address a particular issue. So to give you an example of that kind of work, we are on the Zero Carbon Heating Task Force, which is a task force looking at reducing emissions in the property stock in the UK. Now that is a massive part of the challenge and opportunity, if you like, in addressing climate change in this jurisdiction. So we are doing that work with GFI, as well as advising them across their business, and in particular, as they look to grow a kind of quasi-commercial arm to fund their pilot programs, which they will then hope to roll out across society more broadly in response to their efforts to transition to a green economy. So those are 2 examples under climate. If I move to environment, I would touch on Charity Water and the Kaffir Foundation as 2 of our pro bono clients. Charity Water is a wonderful clean water charity. They've brought clean water to over 11 million people in the last decade or so via 50,000+ clean water projects. They came to us because they wanted help to create a legal framework within which they could encourage their donors to commit equity to their cause. So that's what we've done. Our corporate teams and our tax teams have worked together, created the framework, and now donors in this jurisdiction can commit a percentage of their equity on a liquidity event to Charity Water. That will enable them to raise more funds, to fund more projects, and to provide clean water and sanitation to the communities that need it. And of course, in the middle of a pandemic, that is absolutely vital. The Kaffir Foundation works in relation to the Kaffir National Park in Zambia. That is the 2nd biggest national park in Africa. It's about the size of Wales. It boasts a wonderful array of wildlife, as you would expect, but also has a problem with the illegal wildlife trade. So where does our expertise come in? We are drafting partnership agreements and funding agreements so that they can create, fund, maintain and grow an anti-poaching team on the ground and keep their precious wildlife safe. So those are a couple of examples under the environmental heading, if you like. And then sustainability is obviously a very broad theme, but I will just give one example of a pro bono client there, and that is the Impact Investing Institute. The Impact Investing Institute is a non-profit organization looking to accelerate the growth of impact investing in this jurisdiction with a view to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We are on their panel. We advise them, their pro bono panel, we advise them across a number of issues, but most recently we focused on pension scheme trustees and trying to harness the power of the funds in pension schemes if they can be properly and socially deployed. And so we have co-authored a report on impact investing principles for pension trustees, which we hope will have quite an impact in the sector. So if I step back from those examples, which I hope have given you a bit of a flavour of our pro bono work, you'll see that from an ESG perspective, that was all mainly E, if you like, for environment. There's a lot I could say in relation to the S, social, if we were to talk of our refugee work or racial justice, etc. But I think, again, that's for another day or perhaps the Q&A. But the aim with the projects that I've mentioned is, and particularly from my perspective as the director of Pro Bono, is to harness the legal expertise that I've got within the firm to the maximum impact with the partners that we've selected to work with. So hopefully that has given you a flavour of how we're trying to do that. And we can discuss it a bit further during the Q&A. So I'll hand back to Sophie.
That's great, thanks, Sam. So up next we have Paul. So Paul, if you'd like to join me on stage for your short talk. And Paul is a Sustainability and Health and Safety Officer at Travers Smith. So he's going to be talking all about his role and internal initiatives that Travers Smith are implementing in terms of sustainability at the firm. So Paul, if you want to come up on stage, if you want to press that blue button that says share audio and video and join me up on stage. If you're having any problems, Paul, we'll go over to Rafaela for now. So Rafaela, if you want to join me up on stage for your short talk, and then Paul, we'll come back to you. Oh, Paul, oh, we've got you, Paul, great. Okay, perfect. I'll put up your slides for you.
Sorry, thank you. Slides up now. Okay. Good afternoon, all. Operational sustainability. If I can just introduce myself first of all. So by way of introduction, I'm Paul Mullis. I'm the Sustainability and Health and Safety Officer at Travers Smith. I've been with the company for over 25 years, a big wow, so I think that speaks for itself. And I've seen firsthand how far it and the industry in general has come in operational sustainability, especially in my previous role within the organisation as heading up the facilities team. I took on this new role on the 1st of May last year, and it's been a very interesting time to take on a new role like this, but it's been very enjoyable and a very steep learning curve. Next slide, please. Okay, our internal sustainability strategy and aims. Reducing our impact on the environment is a top priority for many law firms, and we're always looking at new ways of implementing sustainable improvements in the day-to-day running of the business. And this is where I come into effect. It is vital that any initiatives we introduce resonate with our staff, suppliers and clients in order for them to succeed. Next slide, please. Reducing environmental impact. So minimizing energy consumption. Reducing our impact on the environment is the top, there are three main areas that we can look at to reduce our impact. Minimizing energy consumption. We have an energy management system for monitoring energy consumption in our buildings. This allows us to adapt our processes to be as sustainable and as efficient as possible. Recycling methods. This is a passion of mine. Recycling possibly has a huge impact on on a nil-to-fill landfill. Recycling responsibilities have a huge impact on our aim to be a nil-to-landfill company, which I'll discuss further in the next slide. discussing environmental considerations and suppliers. Suppliers and supply chain. After looking into this in more detail, up to 80% of businesses' carbon emissions can come from their supply chain. We are constantly discussing with our suppliers to ensure that their businesses and practices and aims align with ours, and are currently in the process of updating our supplier codes of conduct to reflect this. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, waste, and particularly food waste, recycling is an integral part of reducing our environmental impact. We have recently reviewed our recycling strategy to align it to the Environmental Bill of 2020. This requires all businesses to separate their recycling into 6 different categories, and is due to become UK law in 2023. We are currently recycling 9 different streams, including food, and have a nil to landfill policy. Also, the national recycling rate at the moment is at 44% with a target of 65%. Our current recycling rate stands at 98%. Our kitchen holds a 2-star rating from the Sustainable Restaurant Association and are actively pursuing the coveted 3-star rating. Next slide, please. Engagement, this is a big part. Engagement is key to the success of this strategy. So we've worked hard to increase involvement throughout our organisation and with our clients. We have hosted an sustainable art competition for employees and client children, which proves a great success. As well as that, we've looked at wildlife photographic competitions, and we've put various photos up throughout the office. And this took place during the first lockdown, which was fantastic because it gave us a view into people's gardens and the local parks. We also hold an annual Environmental Awareness Week, hosting a programme of events along with guest speakers such as renowned environmental author and journalist Lucy Siegel. On our hopeful return to the office at some time soon, we are adopting green champions for each department and a league table. Which, considering how competitive lawyers are, this should prove to be very interesting. Next slide, please. Industry collaboration. Yeah, obviously it's a vital part because law firms can play a big part in tackling climate change. We've been a member of the Legal Sustainable Alliance now for over a decade. And one of the current projects we're working on with the LSA is carbon emissions recording for home working. I was reading a report earlier on, and in April last year, I think 47% of the workforce was working from home. So it just shows you what a big area that is to capture. Next slide, please. Right, next stage is for continued improvement throughout 2021. So 2021 will see us continue to improve and a sustainable strategic strategies. We're working on meeting the requirements of internationally recognised accreditations for effective energy management and consumption, among other things, and we'll be increasing our lines of carbon reporting. So that will be called monitoring, recording, reporting in line with our carbon reduction strategy. I do hope this has given you an idea of the direction Travers Smith is travelling and how we are proactively tackling environmental issues and sustainable issues. Thank you.
That was great, thank you, Paul. And last but not least, we have Rafaela joining us to give her short talk. So Rafaela, if you'd like to join me on stage to give the last of the short talks. Rafaela is an associate in the Private Equity and Financial Sponsors Group at Travers Smith. So Rafaela, great, perfect. Over to you, Rafaela. Oh, Rafaela, if you just want to press share audio and video and join me back on screen, ready for your short talk. But in the meantime, whilst we're waiting, everybody in the audience, if you want to take a look at the poll that we've got in today. So if you go to event and then click on polls, you'll see the question that we've got in is what should law firms prioritise as they focus on ESG? So whilst we're waiting for Rafaela to join us, do cast your vote. We have a few options in. Oh, there we go. Okay, Rafaela, I'll hand over to you.
Cool. Hello. Hi, my name's Rafaela. Thank you, Sophie, and thank you to all of you who have joined the event today. So as Sophie said, I'm an associate in our private equity and financial sponsors team, so the same team as George. And I'm just going to give a brief overview of a few examples of the types of things that we've been involved with. And I think I just want to begin by saying that as an associate and also when I was a trainee at Travers, I think the firm is very supportive of people getting involved in pro bono opportunities. And we're very lucky we don't have billable hours targets, and it really is seen as pro bono and getting involved in these things is really seen as an important part of our development. So then just kicking off with a few examples, as Sam mentioned, one of the things we've been working with is the Chancery Lane project. And so that's a collaboration of lawyers, and really the output of our work with the Chancery Lane project is called a climate contract playbook, which is freely available to download online. I'd encourage you all to have a look at it. And we've contributed 3 or 4 different clauses to the playbook so far. And the first one we did is called Bella's Clause, and that's because all of the contracts are named after children. Obviously, children and adults can have the same name, but I named Bella's Clause after my sister, and it's something that is George's idea actually to put this together. And Bella's Clause is an equity ratchet. So what that is in extremely simple terms is if you think of clients like investment managers, so people that we work with, they would typically incentivize the management teams of their business by saying, if the business meets X amount of profits over the next few years, then you managers will get a slice of the pie, and your slice will be this big, which is all well and good and as is expected. But if we kind of think of this shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, what we've introduced is ESG targets as well. So what we're saying is that, yes, you need to meet the financial targets, but also you need to ensure that, for example, the business is going to meet net zero carbon emission targets. The group is going to appoint a sustainability officer or have a sustainability committee, or the group is going to ensure that all of its energy and electricity providers are sort of green certified providers. So it's ensuring 2 things really. One, that ESG considerations are put on the same platform as financial considerations for businesses, and not just an afterthought. But also, I think as lawyers, it's ensuring that we don't just implement laws that are kind of handed down to us, and we don't just advise our clients on things that are already out there, but we can be part of the solution, and we can take an active role in thinking of ways in which our practice areas can be set up in a way to encourage businesses to have these ESG considerations at the forefront of all decision making. And that at Travers, I think, is really part of our aim to be thought leaders in this area. So not only have we done the equity ratchet, which I've explained earlier, but also we've been involved in things like drafting environmental warranties for SPAs, incentive plans for public companies, and we've got a few other things in the pipeline as well. So it's a really good opportunity for us as lawyers to get involved in this. And then I think just a few other examples of sorts of things we've done. As Sam mentioned, there are different pillars that our pro bono program is set up under, and one of them is vulnerable groups. And one of the first pro bono projects that I was involved with as a trainee was involved in setting up a charity called Refugees at Home. And so refugees obviously fall under that bucket of vulnerable groups. And that's because setting up a charity is much like setting up a company. So it's definitely an area where we can use our legal skills as a trainee or associate to help in these ways. And what Refugees at Home does is it matches people with a spare room with asylum seekers and refugees who need a place to stay. So it's a very simple concept, but very effective. And I'm glad to tell you that as of today, they have hosted and provided 178,345 nights of accommodation for people in need. So really excellent and inspiring work, and a real privilege for me, at least when I was a trainee, to be involved in setting that up kind of 5-6 years ago now. And then just very briefly, just to comment on a few other things that we're doing from a diversity perspective. The firm has signed up to the 10,000 Black Interns programme, which you might have heard of, which basically means that the firm, alongside many other people in the industry and across other industries like the investment industry, accounting industry, construction industry, has pledged to provide paid internships for Black students next summer. And this was a program that was set up by a few people from the investment industry, notably Wal Kolade as well, who is actually one of our clients and is the head of Living Bridge, which is one of our client investment companies. And the second thing to say is that the firm has also signed up to the Race Fairness Commitment, which was a charter that was set up in conjunction with the Black Solicitors Network and Rare Recruitment, and effectively means that Travers Smith and lots of other law firms are committing to really not just not just saying that they will do good things, but they're really committing to be anti-racist. Which both of those initiatives obviously sprung from the death of George Floyd over summer, and the Black Lives Matter movement and kicked off after that. So I think all of these things, for me anyway, as an associate, just really go to show that Travers and businesses and the society more generally aren't just treating diversity, sustainability, ESG as just buzzwords, but really they're trying to make a difference and really commit to change. So that was all I was going to say, and I think now we're moving to questions. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Rafaela, and amazing to hear about the work that you're doing. So if I'd like to invite George, Sam and Paul to join us back on stage, and like Rafaela said, we're going to get into some questions and have a panel discussion for the next half an hour. So George and Paul, if you'd like to join me back on stage, just wait for Paul to join us. And we'll get into our first question, and we're going to stick on the theme of sustainable capitalism in 2021. And our first question is from Alexandra Riley-Joseph at the University of Loughborough. And she asks, how do you think this new era of sustainable capitalism and ESG requirements has changed and will continue to change your respective practice areas and roles within the firm? Now, you have all touched on this, but if you could maybe go into a little bit more detail. George, you touched on how it's affecting your work in the private equity sector. If you'd like to start us off here. Yeah,
of course. Yeah. So I mean, it sort of affects my job in two ways, I guess. One in my capacity as a member of the sustainability initiative that I mentioned, but as you say, yeah, it also affects my job as an actual private equity lawyer advising on transactions. I think sustainable business or ESG issues are becoming increasingly important for all private equity investors because of some of the reputational concerns that I mentioned earlier. I mean, also because they're investors, the people who invest in their funds, which they use to buy and sell companies, increasingly demand them to take sustainability into account, and also the regulation that I mentioned. But I think probably more fundamentally than that, actually, private equity funds have just been quicker than a lot of other sort of investors perhaps to understand the importance of ESG in investment decisions genuinely. As I mentioned, I think they are genuine risks and opportunities which can't be ignored, and which go to the sustainability and longer term profitability of the investments that they make themselves. So, increasingly, I think investors generally are coming to appreciate that poor ESG performance can mean an increased risk of legal liability, fines, maybe even regulatory intervention. If you are, I think it's reasonable to assume that if a business is carrying on a way which is massively polluting the environment, that's an activity that has got to be at risk of being prohibited in the future. So it just doesn't make sense not to take these things into account. It is also an opportunity, as I said, improving employee safety, for example, to take a very basic example, and inclusion in the workplace can promote a more motivated workplace and better staff retention. So sometimes actually finding in businesses which don't do these things well and then stepping in and using the control and the influence that they have to make sure that they do can be an opportunity. So I think that you can't argue that it's unarguable that these things need to be taken into account and properly addressed in order for funds to fulfil their duties to their investors. And how do they go about it? Increasingly, a lot of the funds have their own sort of dedicated in-house teams and policies and procedures. And I think ESG considerations feature in all three key stages of the investment process. So that, both picking the sector and the investment itself that you're going to invest in, looking at that potential target, and this is where we come in and doing the due diligence to make sure to understand the way that its affairs are organised, and then after you've done the deal, monitoring it, getting the information that you need from the business to understand how it's performing and how you can improve it. So yeah, it's becoming more and more fundamental.
That's great, thank you. And Sam, in terms of your work in the pro bono department?
Yeah, I think when I was thinking about the structure of how our program would look in kind of early 2019 with a view to putting it in place 2020, climate was very much at the forefront of everyone's minds, and hence climate, environment and sustainability being right up there and as our sort of pillar one, if you like. But since then, you know, we've seen the S in ESG come forward pretty strongly in the last year. All of the racial justice activity last year, the George Floyd murder, the BLM movement, brought that very strongly into focus. So that's an area of growth, albeit we were already present in that space from 2019 and prior to that. But that has brought that into the sort of public eye, and also into the eye of the board that runs Travers Smith and runs all our sort of major clients. And also, you know, you look at the domestic abuse kind of pandemic that's running alongside the health pandemic. And again, people are starting to see that that's a responsibility that employers should look to address. And it's an issue that affects people all around, including your colleagues. So I think when I started to move into this role from a purely commercial litigator role, albeit I've done pro bono for 15 odd years, but when I was really looking to transition, I was expecting climate to be the one of the very strong elements of the new role, and it will be. But I suspect, as we've seen a lot of E for the last year or so, the S is coming quite strongly behind it. And I've been on a few webinars of late with leaders in the refugee space, and they are saying the same thing. I think people expect leading businesses and leading firms to take responsibility socially as well as environmentally. So I would expect the footprint in both an environmental and a social level to grow quite significantly in my job, but also with regards to our clients' obligations and what our paid lawyers are looking at.
Thank you. And Paul, we were just talking about how sustainable capitalism and ESG requirements, how they've changed and will continue to change your role within the firm. So how about you as a sustainability officer? How's your role changed over the past few years?
Well, as I said, I went into this role from the 1st of May last year, so it's been an interesting transition. For me, the actual whole COVID pandemic has brought on various changes. My role, looking at, if you look at ESG, there's a bit on there around health and safety, and then obviously the environment part. And that's really become, in the sort of legal community, I work with the LSA, so it's the Legal Sustainable Alliance, which involves lots of other law firms, and we sit around tables and see what we can do to combat climate change and how we can look at it and how we can look at our emissions. And for me, I think the biggest part is becoming more and more aware of, as a business and as a practice, the whole business. It's not just your direct emissions from your buildings, which I spoke about earlier on, and other parts of it. It's your indirect emissions. So it's things like your supply chain, how your supply chain, and what is that, and how can you work with them to align them with your commitments to climate change. How can you help them record their emissions, and then looking at a policy and looking at a program of trying to reduce. There's been a lot of commitment put out there by other law firms, and yeah, it's making that commitment, but it's making sure that you can actually get to that commitment and how you get there and working out that program. The Climate Change Committee on the 9th of December last year announced a new paper. I wouldn't say that you would read it, it's 1,000 pages long, but there are extracts you can take from that. And there's 4 parts of that, and a big part of that is expanding on your carbon reporting, because until you can get baselines across your business of what you do in various practice areas, how can you look to improve on that, and how can you look to bring that down? So that's really got to be the first line. Look at your baseline. There's things called SBTs now, there's science-based targets, and there's a science-based target initiative that some firms can sign up to. We haven't signed up to that as yet, because it's a process that I want to go through to build that picture, to make sure that when we do commit, we can make those commitments. And for me now, it's building a picture for us over the next 3 to 5 years, and a strategy to reduce our carbon emissions, which is a big part of it, work with the supply chain, work with the Sustainable Alliance, and just build up that whole picture.
That's great, thank you. And moving on to something that you talked about, Sam, your pro bono work, we had a question that came through from Maggie Ong at the University of Bristol, who asks more about your pro bono practice focusing on climate, environment and sustainability. And she asks if you could share your experiences of a pro bono sustainability focused project that you've worked on. So you mentioned a few during your talk. Maybe you could talk us through one in a bit more detail.
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned, quite a few as I was going through the talk, but what I'll probably do is pick on one that I didn't mention. So this was one of our clients is called Social and Sustainable Capital. They're a fund manager driven by social impact, and we have worked with them for almost a decade now, I think, since inception. And they have 3 funds going, and one of the ones that we papered recently was their Social and Sustainable Housing Fund. Now that sits at about £60 million at the moment, and what they do with that is they provide loans in the kind of £2 to £5 million space to charities that work with vulnerable communities, so that they can invest in buildings and housings and infrastructure, if you like, and house them and grow their contributions. So it's an interesting example from a sustainability perspective, because on the one hand, I've got my funds lawyers working and tax lawyers working on creating a fund to generate money which can be deployed to help vulnerable groups. In another limb of the pro bono practice, we're acting directly for those, and I'm in court quite often for these same people, getting them injunctions, etc. And I'm very conscious of the needs that they have, and the lack of safe housing, etc. is a massive problem. So it is nice to see the interaction between 2 of our pro bono clients, if you like. And that same client, the most recent thing we did for them was we papered their acquisition of an entity called Leapfrog Bridge Finance, which is a low carbon innovator. And again, that expands their presence in the renewable energies market and their ability to do more in that space. And that space is obviously critical in our fight against climate change. It needs to grow quickly. We've got lots of paying clients working in that space as well. So again, for me, it's nice to see the complement between the pro bono work and the sort of paid legal expertise. And I think as a collective effort, that is what is going to have the biggest impact. So that's probably the example I'd give in relation to that.
That's great, thanks, Sam. And before we move on to our next topic, all about life at Travers Smith, I'd like everybody to go over to the poll that we've got in today. So if you click on the tab that says event on the right-hand side, you'll see the second tab along under there is polls. And you'll see the question that we've got in today is, what should law firms prioritise as they focus on ESG? Is it a shift towards a paperless office, ethical supply chains, pro bono projects, or minimising business travel? So everybody watching and speakers as well, if you click on an option to cast your vote, and you'll see how everybody else has voted. At the moment, we have a clear winner, which is ethical supply chains with 60% of the votes, followed by pro bono projects, Sam, you'll be pleased to see. And then we've got a shift towards a paperless office with 10%, and minimising business travel with just 4% of the votes. So speakers, what are your takes on this? How did you vote? George, if I could go to you first.
I voted for pro bono projects because I think the scope of I'm coming at this obviously from a Travers Smith perspective. The scope of our pro bono is so broad. It includes both doing good and helping, sort of promote ESG externally, but also sort of, particularly when you think about the work that Raf described for the Chancery Lane project, designing financial products which actually might drive behaviour in other organisations, which, it amplifies the effect. And I just think that has huge potential. So it was a bit of a snap judgment, but that's why I picked that, because I think that's a rare opportunity for lawyers to use their skills to great good, I think.
And Rafaela, how did you vote?
Exactly the same, and for the same reasons. I definitely wasn't going to vote for minimising business travel. I agree. I think and again, it's because our pro bono program is so broad. I think it's an opportunity for lawyers to make a difference.
And Sam, did you vote for pro bono projects?
Yeah, I'm a bit predictable. I think there's a bit of self-preservation going on with this vote. I did, albeit I really can see, if we're talking about supply chains, not solely a law firm supply chain has an impact. When you start looking at all of our clients and all of their supply chains, then you really do start to have an impact. So I think, and actually there are a lot of issues in supply chains. So I think if you can stretch the reach out to all of our clients and all of their supply chains, you really are having a massive impact. But I'm duty bound to go with pro bono projects. And I agree with George, you know, what we're ultimately trying to do with our pro bono projects is find the opportunities to make real change. And if we can draft that legislation or reshape the way that finance works, then ultimately that is going to create the macro change a bit quicker than the supply chain stuff.
And Paul, how about you?
I'm the odd one out. So I voted for ethical supply chains. Reason being, I've been working in that field. I can see what value it can bring. Having a supplier code of conduct that's a robust one, that your supply chain will sign up to and adhere to when you're looking for a supplier and tendering for a supplier, is really key and important. And to give you an example, I use us at Travers Smith as an example. I mean, we pay the London living wage. We make sure everyone is fairly treated. We've mentioned as a group that changes that COVID have brought, and there has been, so I'll give you an example, where our offices have been closed, things like a cleaning team. Most of them have been furloughed, with their cleaning company paying 80%. We've picked up the difference. We've picked up that extra 20% to make sure they've received 100% of their salary. So we're very conscious about not just our employees, but the people that work for us, and we want that to filter down into our supply chain. And really, how can you do that? How big is your supply chain, and how can you have maximum impact? Well, you know, you can do that when you're looking at your suppliers, and the supplier code of conduct will give you that guide through, and getting your supplier to sign up to that, to say that they agree to certain ethical ways of handling things. And obviously it goes above working hours, wages, slave and child labor, you know, ethical standards. It goes on and on and on. And you can draft, if you draft up a robust one of those, and get your supply chain to sign up to it, I think you're going down the right pathway.
That's great, thanks, Paul. So we're now going to move on to our next topic, which is all about life at Travers Smith. So what does day-to-day life look like in each of your roles? I'm sure no 2 days look exactly the same, but George, as a partner in the private equity and financial sponsors group, and also in your article with Legal Cheek, you talked about how you're a partner in the firm's sustainable business initiative. What does day-to-day life look like for you?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's no sort of standard day. And there are lots of parts of my job. So yeah, I'm a deal lawyer, as you say. First, that's probably the thing that takes up the most of my time. It's not the most important thing, but it takes up the most of my time. And so I run transactions for my investor clients, and that's very up and down. It's the nature of a transactional role in terms of the time commitment. There are peaks and troughs, and the peaks can be very intense, but we do get a bit of downtime in the troughs when I then turn to other things. But at times when I'm very busy, it will take up all of my ordinary working day and more, late into the night often. I'm also one of 10 partners in my department, and between us, we manage the team. So that the private equity and financial sponsors team is about 40 associates, 6 trainees, 7 paralegals. And so together with the 9 other partners, I help to run and manage that team and manage the strategy of that team. And then I'm primarily responsible for the associates that share my room with me. We have this, I don't know if you've heard about our room system, but we're still very proud of our room system. So I take an even more active role in the careers of those 3 associates that share a room with me. And so that probably takes up a couple of hours of every day as well, that sort of departmental partner role. And then it's sustainability, which is a passion of mine and is really important, and is taking up slowly more and more time actually. And sometimes it might be a full day of a week, dotted around the week. And then business development, particularly as a corporate partner, part of my job is making sure that we maintain our links with clients, and we try and bring in new ones occasionally. So that takes up a fair amount of time. And then training is probably the final thing I would mention, which is, almost it's one of the things I enjoy the most actually, and one of the things I'm most proud about is we take training very seriously. We believe in training up technically excellent lawyers, and so lots of my time actually is one of my specific roles within my department is focusing on the training program for our young private equity lawyers and helping them to develop, and then delivering that as well. So yeah, very varied, lots to do.
And Rafaela, as an associate in the team, what does your day-to-day life look like?
So I suppose my first job is to keep the partners that I work with happy. So So as George said, we sit in rooms with different partners, and so I'll tend to work mainly with the partner that I'm sitting with in whatever she's doing at the time. I think on a transaction, so just briefly, a transaction, in any transaction, you're either basically buying or selling a company, and you might be on the buy side or the sell side. And there's kind of two, I think in my head, two big bits to that. One is the diligence side of things, and so in my role, I'd be coordinating diligence across our specialist teams, and if the business is an international business, we'll be coordinating diligence more broadly across overseas law firms as well, and being that kind of main client contact and providing those regular updates on how things are going and running the timetable. But also working with the junior lawyers and the trainees and supporting them where they need to and leaning on them as necessary. And then onto the main kind of the more transactional side of things, there's the documentation that's involved, so the share purchase agreement or the investment agreement, so kind of helping with drafting bits of that, and then drafting all of the ancillary documentation, and again providing updates to the client and taking client instructions. So there is a lot of project management, and then there's also a lot of considering the legal concepts that are needed to ensure your clients' outcomes are achieved.
And Sam was Director of Pro Bono, and also whilst you were working in a dispute resolution team, what did your life look like?
Yeah, what did my life look like? It's a broad question. Different now is the answer. So when I was in disputes, I would typically for the last few years have at least one major project. I was on a £3 billion dispute for 3 years, significant fraud case, which was my primary driver, with a number of cases around that and pro bono work and committee work. And from that, I moved on to an even larger case, which had about 10 different arms to it, and took on even more pro bono work. So there's a lot of juggling involved, sort of 2018, 2019 time. And now I'm in this role. I'm lucky that I can purely dedicate myself to pro bono. So if we take my first day back last week, a typical day, I'm not sure this is typical, but it was certainly an enjoyable day. My first meeting was with a domestic violence advocacy team that I've got representing a client that afternoon in a return hearing. So I was prepping them for how that case was likely to play out and the questions from the judge. I then went straight to a meeting with my newly seconded associate who's come into my team, who's helping me out, where we discussed strategy and plans for her role and plans for addressing and growing the work across the firm. I then went into a meeting with an innovation fund, along with a bunch of our commercial lawyers and partners, where we were particularly focused with their investment directors on carbon emission reduction across the property sector in the UK and how we could work together to address that. I then went into another meeting with another domestic abuse team, where we were handling, alongside criminal lawyers we brought onto the team, we were looking at how we could prosecute the abuser in that case, which is something that our firm had never done before. So I'm looking at that with the right expertise and seeing how we can assist our client there. And then I moved on to some sort of document work, if you like, after that, looking at the justice report, which we've been working on for about a year, which is looking into the overrepresentation of BAME youth in the criminal youth justice system, and the product of that panel that we've been the corporate partners for since autumn 2019. It has now been produced and it's now being finalised. So I'm deep in review of that, and that probably took me into the evening. So that was my first day back, and feels like a privilege to be on those meetings. It still does, 10 months into the role, loving every day of it really. So I'm pretty lucky, I think.
That's great, thanks. And over to you, Paul, as Sustainability and Health and Safety Officer.
Yeah, so there's two arms to my job. As I mentioned earlier on, I've been at Travers for over 25 years now, so I'm one of those sort of sticks of rock you break me, and I say Travers Smith in the middle. The firm has been great for me to work alongside. I was originally in the facilities role, ended up head of facilities and doing the day-to-day operational side of things, which did involve health and safety. That's the foundation stone for facilities, really. But I used to be on the environmental committee, worked on that for a decade, really passionate about that. And I think the firm managed to recognise that and from the 1st of May last year, offered me this new role, which I jumped at. As I said, I'm a bit geeky as well, so I could work in one area which I'd been used to, the health and safety bit. Hadn't been used to COVID-19, obviously, like none of us. So that was a steep learning curve. And this sounds rather boring, but writing a 68-page risk assessment to get us all back to the office at various stages successfully was great. I found it very interesting, and researching the government guidance and looking at Public Health England and going through all the other various processes, being a point of contact and developing our own sort of COVID reporting system as well, with our HR teams. And it actually gave me a sense of pride to walk around our offices and see how we developed them to make them safe for people to return when they could. Obviously, at the moment, the offices are closed during lockdown. And that, but also the way, not only did we do the health and safety part of it, but how we looked after people's well-being, and we considered that as well. And I thought that was great, the way we just approached the whole COVID situation from a health and safety point of view, and the stuff that we provided for people at home, and how we managed our offices to keep everyone safe. So that was one part of it, and one part mostly I wasn't expecting in that role. Part of my other health and safety, put my health and safety out, is I audit our files, look at our processes, look where we can improve on those, and basically obviously adhere to legislation and the law. The other side, my other arm, which is the sustainability part. As I said, I've been on the committee for more than a decade. It's a bit more of a steep learning curve, so I had to learn more, but my day-to-day parts of that are really more strategic now, which I really enjoy. So I developed and wrote our Modern Slavery Act statement, which is published on our external website. I was heavily involved in writing our supplier code of conduct, which I was talking about earlier on, and linking up with our supply chains. And at the moment, I'm putting a paper together. It's a sustainable review paper for our environmental board, looking at what we should be doing and why we should be doing them. It's really interesting looking at what others in the legal community are doing and using that as a benchmark for yourself and wanting to exceed that. Also, the other great thing is being able to link in, as I've mentioned before, the Legal Sustainable Alliance, and work together in collaboration with other firms like Linklater, Stalters and May, and overcome, climate challenges together as organisations. And it's the first time for me I felt real part of a community outside Travers Smith as well as inside Travers Smith. So for me, it's been great.
Thanks, Paul. And that actually leads us really nicely into our next question, which is from India Rothschild at Durham University, who asks, what attracted you to respective practice areas and your roles within the firm? So Rafaela, if I could go to you first.
Yeah, sure. So I trained at Travers and I did seats in 4 different departments. And I think I actually thought I'd want to qualify into litigation first. I think a lot of people begin with that idea as well because they're so used to movies and telling us that we should all be lawyers and in court and whatnot. But what attracted me to our private equity department, I think, was the pace of the transactions. I think I'm quite impatient actually, and I quite like the fact that in the 6-month seat, I got to see 6 or 7 different transactions, all moving at different paces. And in our day-to-day job, I mean, a transaction can take a couple of months or be much shorter or much longer, but you do get to see quite a lot of them, and also you get quite a lot of responsibility. And I just really like our team. I think we work in a great team, and and things that I didn't realise half the businesses that I interact with on the high street have some kind of private equity structure going on in the background. So I think that's really what attracted to me to our private equity team and the role that I'm in now.
And George, do you have anything to add to that?
It's a very similar story for me, to be honest. I mean, I actually thought I would want to be a litigator as well when I joined. It's not to do down litigation or dispute resolution, as it's known at Travers Smith. I very much enjoyed that seat, but I just love the pace, like Rafaela. I really enjoyed the pace of the transactions. I like working in really small teams, and we do work in quite small teams, 3 or 4 people on each aspect of the transaction, and we work very, very closely with our clients. We're always on the phone. It's very informal on private equity transactions, and very commercial, very fast moving. You're working with highly intelligent, highly motivated people to very compressed timetables, and so that's very challenging. But I really enjoy it. Get a bit of a buzz from it. I must admit, you get slightly less of a buzz doing it completely from home. It's slightly different at the moment to what it used to be, but obviously, hopefully, we'll be back to that before too long.
And Sam, what about dispute resolution? What drew you to that?
Yeah, I think looking at the disputes, it was really the human element of it. I like the human drama. Behind every dispute, there's always a good human story. And that £3 billion one I talked about, we were defending an individual accused of the largest fraudulent claim in his country's history. And his life and livelihood was on the line, and he was 100% innocent. So spending many years, in fact, trying to defend him was a real human connection. And I realized that I like all of the processes. I like the investigation, I like the witness interviews, the cross-examination, barristers, judges, the whole sort of setup, if you like. I enjoy the whole thing, the strategy. So all of that from the disputes perspective was what attracted me to it. In the pro bono role, I still do a decent number of disputes at any one time. I'll have 2 or 3 dispute cases sort of on the go. But I kind of have the benefit of being an almost GC role, if you like, because I get to see across the whole firm. In a typical day, I'm looking at funds work, tax work, disputes, and straight corporate work, but all with the goal to have an impact and do some good. So I think that sort of wraps it all together and makes it all enjoyable as well. So both good roles.
That's great, thanks Sam. And we're going to move on to our final question, which is from Natasha Hertz at the University of Birmingham, who asks, what advice would you give your younger self if you were applying to law firms and looking to enter the profession in these uncertain times? So perhaps Paul, if I could come to you first, but more broadly about entering the world of work at the moment, what would be your advice to your younger self?
Oh, to my younger self, God, that's casting back. Right, so turning the clock back 25 years from when I joined here, and I worked for banks before that, when they had bartering systems, I think was the situation there. No, my advice would be, look at the sustainable arm. I've got children that are just finishing at university, and, again, the way everything's moving, the way the economy is moving, and moving forward, we've got Boris's 10-point plan that takes us up to 2050. The climate change, they've released a new carbon budget that's been released, which is all around carbon emissions and farming and things like that. And my eldest son, he's finished university and wants to go into architecture. So he's looking at the sustainable arm of architecture, what he can do, sustainable housing. So me personally, from my perspective, would be looking at sustainability. It's the future. It's something that we've all got to sign up to. It's something that will make positive change, won't it, for us all.
Thanks, Paul. And Sam, what would be your advice to your younger self?
Well, I might say get a better haircut before you go to work would have been day one, because I got a bit of abuse for my funny hair when I went in. But aside from that, I think a lot of people are worried at the moment because the world is so uncertain. Probably the only thing we can be sure of is that it's going to be uncertain for the foreseeable future. So I would try not to worry about uncertainty. It is the nature of things. I qualified in 2008 into litigation when nobody was getting a job in litigation because everyone was just doing deals, and then the entire global economy crashed, and all of a sudden the world looked like a different place. Dial forward 2016, we all vote for Brexit and the world changes again. And then last year, COVID comes in. So who knows what this year or the next 5 years have got in store for us. But there will certainly be more uncertainty to come. I think probably pick an employer that treats you with respect, that has demonstrated they are very good at what they do and has a solid foundation, because as the world shakes a business, you want to be in a business which can withstand it. And you want to be treated well where you work, because times will get tough. Being a lawyer is a marathon, not a sprint, as I always say. And to get through it, you need to have good people around you to support you, and so you can support them. So, pick your employer carefully, and make sure you enjoy what you do, because these are demanding jobs, and if you don't enjoy it, you will not have a long and enjoyable career.
Thanks, Sam. Rafaela?
Yeah, so I'd say it's important to see everything as a learning opportunity and as good experience. I think it can be really hard to find appropriate work experience and things now, but I think really anything is good experience. And yes, you might not be able to get good work experience or attend certain events, but I think there's loads of things available online. Lots of seminars and stuff are being freely available, and I think there's just loads of learning opportunities, and I think there are all ways to improve applications and to find out a bit more about what you're interested in. And events like this as well, a good example of that.
Great, thanks, Rafaela. And George?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Sam said, really, the pace of change at the moment is, can feel quite alarming if you stop to think about it for too long. Both geopolitical and technological. Everything is changing extremely rapidly. It's incredibly hard to keep up, and it's incredibly hard to work out where we're going to end up. So I think trying to predict the future and pick, what's going to be profitable or what's going to be, very hard. I think, I like Sam's point around picking an employer that you think will look after you and picking something that you enjoy. I think that's absolutely right. And I think in order to do that, you probably pick a good employer, and then try and get as broad an exposure as you can in the early years to lots of different types of work, and work out what it is you like, and then stick at it. And if you stick at it and you're determined and you keep at whatever it is you've chosen within your chosen employer, then hopefully you'll find yourself in a position where you're an expert and you love what you're doing. I think part of the joy of doing something comes from doing it well. So if you really work at it and you stick at it, then hopefully you'll get to that point. And by showing, hopefully the loyalty that you've shown will be returned. And it's very, very hard to predict, but I think that's the key.
That's great, thanks, George. And I think that's a really nice note to end on, because unfortunately that's all we have time in terms for the panel discussion.